A terrifying mutated virus suddenly erupts in the Arctic. Within hours, an infected person's entire body tissue dissolves into dark blood. Though a small number survive, they become mindless zombies. What on earth is happening? The story must begin from the start. At the very moment the virus broke out, relevant personnel noticed the situation and immediately reported it. The corporation took this extremely seriously. They swiftly collaborated with the military and urgently dispatched an elite team to investigate. The team leader is named Alan, a renowned PhD in biology. Alan was somewhat reluctant about this sudden assignment, as many experts within the corporation were more specialized than him. Upon learning of his doubts, the corporation patiently explained everything to Alan, and he finally understood that among the first 3 infected individuals, one of them was his younger brother, Peter. Hearing this news, Alan was deeply shocked. He then decisively accepted the company's arrangement, leading the other 3 team members to swiftly head for the Arctic research base. During this time, team member Sarah noticed that Alan seemed to have a significant conflict with a member named Julia. Later, she learned from member Doreen that Julia and Alan were once married but divorced due to certain events. Rumors suggested it was Alan's brother, Peter, who betrayed his brother. Soon after, they finally arrived at their destination. Dr. Hatake, the base director, warmly received the group. Under his guidance, relevant staff implanted access chips into Alan's team. Only after this was done did they take the elevator down to the research facility. Alan immediately went to check on his brother's condition. It's noteworthy that Julia also insisted on going along too. Perhaps those rumors were not entirely baseless. They arrived at the isolation chamber and were instantly stunned by the sight before them. Peter's body was covered in black veins, while the other 2 infected individuals had completely decomposed. Based on the current situation, it was almost impossible for Peter to survive the night. Perhaps sensing his brother's presence, Peter seemed to calm slightly, appearing less agonized. Just as Alan prepared to question Peter, an unexpected event occurred. Peter suddenly lost control and attacked them. Fortunately, Alan and the others reacted swiftly, subduing his brother. They then injected Peter with a sedative to prevent another violent outburst. Peter's condition is now extremely critical. An antidote must be developed urgently. As they had never encountered anything like this before, they decided to start with the pathogen. To identify the pathogen's source, Alan went alone to Peter's room to search for useful clues. By chance, he discovered his brother's work journal, finding a video inside specifically left for him by Peter. While watching, Alan noticed his brother maintained a peculiar gesture throughout, a secret hand signal understood only between them, hinting at escape. Alan couldn't understand why his brother wanted him to flee. After leaving Peter's room, Alan returned to the isolation chamber only to be shocked to find his brother gone. Peter seemed to have torn through the metal ceiling barehanded, then crawled into the ventilation duct to escape. To ensure the safety of others in the lab, Hatake decided to pump toxic gas into the ducts, sacrificing Peter for the greater safety of all. Although Alan was reluctant to accept this, he could only agree. His sole request was to retrieve his brother's remains. Hatake did not refuse. Soon after, Alan entered the ducts to search for Peter's body. Not long into his search, he found the body of a man. However, upon approaching, he saw it was not Peter, but a member of the security team. Strangely, this member's right hand had been severed. This suggested Peter had already escaped the ventilation system, placing everyone in the base in grave danger. Meanwhile, team member Doreen remained unaware of all this. She was in the lab preparing for live specimen experiments, but she was astonished to discover that such a large research facility had no monkeys for testing. With no alternative, she had to use lab mice for the experiment instead. After research, Doreen found this mysterious virus had a very unusual transmission method. It wasn't spread through the air like common viruses. Just as she prepared for further study, her assistant Sergio accidentally found monkey hair in a drain. Doreen immediately realized the lab staff were lying, but she didn't understand why they would hide this. To uncover the truth, Doreen and Sergio secretly investigated the Institute's secrets. They soon noticed one room was deliberately locked, clearly meant to keep outsiders out. Doreen was certain this room likely held the origin of everything. Sergio, using lock-picking skills learned in the military, easily opened the door. Upon entering, they were shocked to find the room densely packed with cages holding monkeys. Clearly, many monkeys had been kept there, but due to some procedure at the Institute, nearly all hundreds of them had died. Just as they thought no monkeys survived there, an unexpected event occurred. Fortunately, Sergio reacted quickly, shooting the monkey dead. Later, they observed that the monkey was also infected. Doreen suspected this monkey was the source of the virus. At the same time, Sarah and Julia were also busy researching the virus. They discovered that although the virus was extremely small, only 15 nanometers, it behaved more like a parasite. Furthermore, Existing databases contained absolutely no records of this virus. Julia promptly reported this discovery to Alan. While everyone was busy researching the virus, they completely failed to notice Sergio secretly leaving the base. Using a small satellite transmitter he had prepared earlier, he relayed the entire situation to a mysterious individual. What's more disturbing is that the area he chose was filled with monkeys frozen into statues of ice. Clearly, the secrets of this research base were far more complex than Alan's team had anticipated. After completing his task, Sergio calmly returned to the Institute as if nothing had happened. He then approached Hatake, casually bringing up matters concerning the corporation's higher-ups, clearly calculating something. Meanwhile, Alan and the others in the lab, after continuous research, discovered the virus had the ability to cause mutations. Peter survived precisely because the viral infection triggered a genetic mutation in him. Meanwhile, Peter, who had escaped quarantine, showed no signs of being in critical condition. On the contrary, he wandered freely throughout the facility and began attacking the scientists. 5 people were quickly attacked, but Peter didn't harm them. Instead, he forced the dark blood from his mouth into theirs, clearly spreading the virus on a large scale. According to Alan's calculations, approximately 18 new infections were expected. Alan hoped to convince these potential infected individuals to surrender peacefully, but Hatake, concerned for the base's security, believed force might be necessary if needed. At that very moment, Doreen, who was dissecting a monkey, encountered an infected person. Strangely, the infected person didn't attack her, but instead kept urging Doreen to flee. Though she didn't understand why, Doreen decided to seize the chance to escape. Unexpectedly, the infected person suddenly changed expression and launched an attack directly at Doreen. But suddenly, the infected person appeared in great pain, spat out a mouthful of blood, and collapsed unconscious. Doreen survived by sheer luck. Meanwhile, Sarah encountered the escaped Peter in the warehouse. He didn't attack her, but warned her to be wary of Hatake. Before Sarah could question him further, Peter vanished back into the ventilation ducts. Sarah reported this incident to Alan. After a moment's thought, Alan found Hatake highly suspicious. However, to uncover the truth, they still needed to find his brother Peter first. Therefore, soon after, Sergio was tasked with entering the ventilation ducts to search for traces of Peter. Alan monitored the situation in real time via cameras. It wasn't long before Sergio located Peter, but Peter attacked Sergio without a word. By the time Alan arrived, Peter had long since left. Alan then examined Sergio, confirming he hadn't been infected by Peter, which brought a small sigh of relief. At the same time, while carefully reviewing Peter's earlier research video, Julia unexpectedly discovered Peter had been using his research to develop a new reagent. She decided to replicate Peter's experiment using lab mice. Julia injected the 2 replicated reagents into different groups of mice. The results left her utterly shocked, because every mouse injected with reagent A rapidly deteriorated and died without exception, while a very small fraction of those injected with reagent B survived. However, these surviving mice were covered in black veins and became extremely aggressive. Julia immediately informed Alan of the discovery. Alan recognized the severity of the situation. He instructed Julia and Sarah to monitor the infected individuals who had voluntarily isolated themselves. He feared these people might also do something irreversible under the virus's influence. Just then, a scientist within the facility seemed to have discovered the base's secret and attempted to leave on a snowmobile. Sergio, witnessing this, directly eliminated him. The scientist's body was soon discovered by Alan and others, and subsequent investigation revealed Sergio was the killer. Alan grew increasingly bewildered, unable to understand what the people at this facility were hiding. He confronted Sergio directly, demanding an explanation, but Sergio remained tight-lipped. As the 2 men stood locked in a stalemate, another unexpected event occurred. While Julia was showering, Peter suddenly burst in and spat black slime into her mouth. When Alan found Julia, she was unconscious on the floor, completely unaware of what had happened, causing Alan great concern. However, as they were no longer married, he couldn't stay long. He could only guard outside the door, hoping to catch his brother Peter. At that moment, Alan heard strange noises coming from the pipes above him. Following the sound, he found Peter in a laboratory room. Alan moved to apprehend him, but Peter suddenly collapsed unconscious. Alan had no choice but to take Peter to the lab, intending to question him upon waking. When Hatake saw the unconscious Peter, his expression immediately turned grave, seemingly displeased that Alan had captured him. Hatake also strongly resisted Alan staying by Peter's side, insisting Peter be isolated in a more remote area. Though Alan was very reluctant, Hatake's reasons were undeniably logical, leaving Alan no opportunity to refuse. He ultimately agreed. Hatake then led Alan to the 2nd underground level, which was previously used for nuclear fusion experiments. It was solid and very secure, making it an ideal quarantine site. Following Alan's suggestion, the entire level became the new quarantine zone. They transferred all infected individuals, including Peter, down there. while the remaining personnel stayed upstairs to continue researching an antidote. Just then, the infected Dr. Suleimani suddenly appeared before them, seemingly seeking help. However, before Alan could respond, Daniel shot her in the abdomen. Fortunately, Alan acted swiftly, managing to save her life. He then ordered Suleimani also be moved to the underground quarantine zone. Alan informed everyone of his decision and announced that Sarah would be responsible for testing personnel for infection. Doreen would continue researching the monkeys to develop the virus antidote as quickly as possible. However, when Doreen arrived at the dissection room, she discovered the monkey was missing. Suspecting Hatake was behind it, she went to confront him but was abruptly stopped by Sergio. Sergio then took her outside the base to collect samples from the pile of frozen monkeys, allowing her to continue her research. Staring at the field of frozen monkeys, Doreen was deeply shocked. She wondered how Sergio knew about this place. Sergio avoided answering directly, only vaguely hinting that everything at the base was military-controlled and he was bound to secrecy. Seeing this, Doreen pressed no further. She took the blood samples back as planned to replicate the virus for further study. But then, as the experiment proceeded, something terrifying happened. The virus began multiplying at an alarming rate. Doreen wanted to immediately confront Hatake about the nature of this research, but Sergio stopped her again. He bluntly stated that if she went, both she and he would end up frozen like those monkeys. Hearing this, Doreen froze once more, forced to swallow her questions and plan her next move carefully. Meanwhile, Alan pressured Hatake. After finding 2 more infected individuals, he learned from them that the mysterious virus now plaguing the base was actually a new type of drug they had been researching. Hatake had never disclosed this to Alan. Alan urgently wanted to know how far Hatake's research had progressed. Under Alan's pressure, Hatake finally revealed the truth. The base was indeed developing a universal cure capable of healing all viruses, but this drug was highly unstable. Both current results were failed products. Drug A had a 100% fatality rate, while Drug B, though somewhat better, still had a staggering 80% fatality rate. At the same time, Sarah finally developed a method for infection testing. The reagent would immediately turn light green upon contact with the mysterious virus. This would definitively confirm if someone was infected. Hearing this, Julia grew uneasy, since she couldn't remember anything about being attacked. So, while Sarah was away, she secretly tested herself. Seeing the reagent didn't change color, Julia finally breathed a sigh of relief. Soon after, they used this reagent to test all laboratory personnel and isolated the infected. Everything seemed to be progressing positively. But then, Suleimani suddenly became violent, attacked the guards, escaped the isolation room, and began wildly attacking everyone she encountered. Witnessing this, Julia instantly recalled her own experience in the shower. The next moment, she spat out a mouthful of dark blood. Julia stared in disbelief because her reagent clearly had not changed color. She immediately realized the reagent was useless, or at least highly unreliable. Julia had no time to lock herself in the quarantine zone. She tried calling Alan only to discover communications had been blocked. It turned out that just minutes before, Alan had realized the situation was completely beyond his control. His abilities were insufficient to handle this crisis, so he planned to use a military satellite to contact the military and have the entire research facility physically erased. Unfortunately, the news leaked. Hatake and Sergio heard it, and their expressions changed drastically. Immediately afterward, they blew up the satellite receiver near the base with explosives. Unnoticed, 4 days passed. Those locked in the quarantine zone completely lost contact with Alan's group on the 2nd level. Seeing their food supplies dwindling to near exhaustion, they grew restless. Some believed Alan's group had abandoned them. In this desperate situation, a small faction of the quarantined decided they would take everyone upstairs down with them. Their plan was simple: shut down the air filters. In 6 hours, the upper levels would run out of breathable air. Julia strongly opposed this. She trusted Alan would never abandon them. However, no one else present was willing to believe Julia. They then locked her outside the isolation chamber. At that moment, a mysterious figure in a protective suit began frantically waving at her. Seeing this, Julia followed directly. But in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. The corridor was empty, leaving Julia utterly bewildered. Meanwhile, the satellite receiver remained unrepaired. After waiting 4 days, Alan was frantic. He knew perfectly well the quarantined group's food was almost gone. Therefore, Alan had proposed letting them return to the upper levels temporarily, but Hatake firmly opposed allowing the infected upstairs. Hatake persistently claimed he would develop the antidote soon. Only when everyone's safety was guaranteed could those people be brought up. Alan couldn't refute this. His only option was to help develop the antidote faster. To this end, he decided to conduct a live experiment on his brother. Despite knowing the immense danger, he could no longer hesitate for the sake of the many others. Alan immediately injected Peter with the preliminary therapeutic drug. The drug took effect rapidly. Before long, Peter calmed down and his consciousness gradually returned. This outcome thrilled Alan. After so long, he could finally speak with his brother again. However, their conversation was interrupted after only a few sentences by Sarah's sudden arrival. Sarah confessed the recent news about the unreliable testing reagent. Hearing this, Alan's briefly relaxed heart tightened once more. Fortunately, the drug he had just developed seemed capable of treating this mysterious virus. Shortly after Sarah left the isolation chamber, she experienced severe physical pain. Sarah wasn't infected. This was an old injury. Not long ago, Sarah had undergone a medical procedure for a tumor. Her body hadn't fully recovered, and not wanting to worry others, she went alone to the warehouse to find morphine for the pain. Back with Alan, his conversation with his brother revealed new information about the virus. Originally, this research had nothing to do with Peter, but he wanted to prove himself. Combined with Hatake's manipulation, it led to the current disaster. As soon as Peter finished speaking, he fell unconscious again. Then, his heartbeat abruptly stopped. Fortunately, Alan was right there. After emergency resuscitation, he managed to revive Peter. However, Peter's condition was critical. He remained unconscious and would most likely be in a persistent vegetative state. Perhaps this was a side effect of the drug. Meanwhile, the infected within the base continued to deteriorate, many transforming into savage zombies. Julia narrowly escaped an attack, saved only by the help of a doctor, Jay. To survive, they went to the warehouse for supplies, only to shockingly discover carvings left by Julia in the past on the wall behind a shelf. The carvings indicated she had been there at some point, yet Julia herself had no recollection of it. Elsewhere, some survivors, suffocating as the air thinned, descended into despair. Hatake arrived with his assistant Daniel, attempting to persuade the three rebels. He promised to ensure their safety if they would reactivate the air filters. Perhaps moved by Hatake's words, they actually lowered their guard. Unexpectedly, Hatake suddenly opened fire and shot them dead. After all, eliminating these few would still restore the air system. Hatake ordered Daniel to dispose of the bodies while he went to find Julia. He then proceeded to the second level, encountering zombie-like infected. Shockingly, they didn't attack Hatake, but instead cowered away in fear. Clearly, Hatake harbored a significant secret. Shifting back to Doreen, after days of effort, she finally made a breakthrough in her virus research. Just as she prepared to report her findings to Alan, Sergio suddenly attacked and killed her. Sergio then staged the scene to look like an accident. Immediately after, he went outside the base, doused gasoline, and set all the frozen monkey sculptures ablaze. It turned out everything he had just done was merely a task assigned by his hidden employer. Upon receiving Sergio's update, the employer immediately assigned a new mission: extract a Dr. Havit from the research base. Sergio had never heard of this person. The research facility has over 20 levels, housing countless researchers. Therefore, Sergio barged into Hatake's office and used his computer to search for information on Dr. Havit. The search results shocked Sergio, as there was absolutely no information about Dr. Havit. Excluding the possibility that his hidden employer was deceiving him, the only explanation was that Hatake had tampered with the data. However, before Sergio could investigate further, Daniel suddenly walked in. Seeing this, Sergio immediately stood up, pretending he was just passing by, and casually probed Daniel for information about Dr. Havit. But Daniel had no knowledge of this person either. He then promptly kicked Sergio out of the office. As for Hatake at this moment, he was still busy searching for Julia. He fabricated injuries to look like assault wounds, then found Julia and Jay. He lied, claiming he was providing supplies to the people on the second level but was attacked by them, and he begged for their help. Julia found Hatake's request very troubling, as she herself was trapped and couldn't leave. Seeing her hesitation, Hatake immediately stated that he knew of an emergency passage that could bypass this level, though the journey might involve some danger. Hearing there was a way out, the kind-hearted Julia immediately decided to help Hatake. Supported by her and Jay, Hatake guided them to the emergency passage. In the end, only Hatake and Julia managed to escape into a laboratory beside the corridor. After a brief rest, they prepared to continue. However, they hadn't gone far before being attacked by infected individuals. At the critical moment, Jay suddenly appeared and successfully rescued them. With Jay's help, Julia was able to perform a simple medical procedure on Hatake. But then, Jay inexplicably vanished again. Although Julia was very reluctant to believe it, the circumstances strongly suggested that Jay was merely her illusion. Everything that had happened earlier had been done by her alone, and this conclusion left her deeply unsettled. She could only suspect it might be related to her infection with the mysterious virus. Meanwhile, Alan finally discovered Doreen, who had been attacked by Sergio. Judging by the scene, it likely appeared to be an accident, though the timing felt far too coincidental. A sense of unease lingered within Alan. He recalled that Doreen underwent annual physical exams and couldn't have suddenly developed a problem causing such an accident. This further convinced him that Doreen's death was no accident. Given this, Alan believed the greatest current threat wasn't the virus, but the hidden secrets within the base. Alan went to the surveillance room to review earlier lab footage, only to find the recordings had already been deleted. There was no doubt it was the work of whoever was behind the scenes. Alan couldn't immediately determine who the killer was. Then Daniel suddenly claimed Sergio was responsible. However, Daniel provided no solid evidence, so Alan didn't readily believe him. After Alan left, Daniel stared meaningfully at the surveillance screen. He then pulled up footage showing Sergio talking with a doctor. Sergio seemed to be inquiring about Dr. Schvitt again. This time, Sergio learned that Dr. Witt, due to illness, couldn't interact with others and was apparently confined somewhere. Seeing this and recalling Sergio's previous inquiries about Dr. Schvitt, Daniel formed a suspicion. He immediately found Sergio and stated he knew his objective. Yet Daniel didn't expose him. He simply ordered Sergio to clean up any related traces. Following Daniel's instruction, Sergio hurried to the morgue to further dispose of Doreen's body. But he found Alan there, performing an autopsy on Doreen. Alan had already noticed the needle mark on Doreen's neck and was certain she was murdered. This made Sergio deeply uneasy. On the other hand, Sarah suddenly realized that Igam was missing. Worried that something might have happened to her, she quickly went out to look for her. She soon encountered Igam in the corridor, but her state was highly abnormal, almost like she was intoxicated. Sarah approached to communicate, but Igam directly attacked her. Fortunately, Sarah reacted swiftly, preventing irreversible harm. She barely managed to calm Igam down, but then she became extremely weak, seemingly in great pain. At that moment, Alan found Sarah and told her he suspected Doreen had been murdered and wanted to discuss what to do next. But he discovered Sarah had taken a large dose of morphine and was now in a very unstable condition. Without hearing her explanation, Alan scolded her for drug abuse and angrily stormed off. After leaving Sarah, Alan encountered Sergio. Sergio falsely claimed that there was a doctor named Dr. Schvitt who had previously been assisting Doreen with her research and that he seemed to know the secrets of the facility. He suggested Dr. Schvitt might be Doreen's murderer. Prompted by Sergio, Alan went to ask Daniel if he knew anything about Dr. Schvitt. Daniel instantly understood the situation. He pointed the finger at Sergio, stating evidence of Sergio murdering Doreen could be found right in his own room. Though skeptical, Alan couldn't dismiss the possibility. So they went together to search Sergio's room. Shockingly, they found dangerous items: a bundle of explosives, a small satellite signal receiver, and the phone he used to communicate with his hidden employer. Recalling the earlier destruction of the satellite receiver, Alan immediately deduced Sergio was the culprit behind it. Just as he was reeling from this discovery, Alan realized Daniel had vanished without a trace. At that precise moment, Daniel had already arrived outside the base where he activated a mysterious device out there. Then, a container holding the head of Dr. Schvitt suddenly appeared before his eyes. Before Alan could react, Sergio materialized like a ghost behind him and mercilessly knocked him unconscious, swiftly snatching the container. However, to Sergio's surprise, on his way back, he encountered Alan, who was anxiously searching for Daniel. Seeing his actions exposed, Sergio immediately attacked Alan, knocking him to the ground. Sergio continued his escape and used his device to send a message to his hidden employer. At that moment, Daniel unexpectedly regained consciousness and decisively eliminated Sergio. He then took away the container holding Dr. Schvitt's head. During the night, Sergio's body was quietly dragged away by a mysterious figure. Naturally, Alan knew nothing of all this. He only demanded Daniel quickly find the escaped Sergio. Meanwhile, inside the base, Sarah wheeled the now-deceased Igam before Alan. Seeing more and more infected individuals dying, one urgent thought consumed Alan: return to the second level immediately and bring Julia back safely. However, Daniel stopped his risky plan. Under the threat of force, Alan could only agree to plan more carefully, but his mind clearly wasn't in agreement. With Sergio missing, Doreen dead, and danger everywhere in the base, Alan couldn't rest easy about Julia. Therefore, he decided to find a way to sneak into the second level. Meanwhile, Julia's hallucinations worsened. She dreamed frequently, seeing her childhood self and even an unharmed Peter. Just as Julia prepared to speak to him, a scream from outside the door jolted her awake. Julia huddled in panic. Coming to her senses, she was horrified to see signs of infection visibly worsening on her body. Fighting to stay conscious, she examined the wound on Hatake's body. By now, Hatake was in much better condition and could speak normally. Julia couldn't help but voice her long-held question. Why hadn't Hatake told her Jay wasn't real? Hatake claimed that, given Julia's current state, an imaginary friend was more beneficial for resisting the infection. However, before Hatake could finish, Julia's condition suddenly deteriorated. Within moments, she fell unconscious. Seeing this, Hatake produced a vial of mysterious red liquid and injected it into Julia. Not long after, Julia's symptoms of pain noticeably lessened. After doing this, Hatake turned and quietly left the room through a secret passage. Meanwhile, Alan and Sarah successfully infiltrated the second level. Faced with a door secured by chains, Alan prepared to cut through them with a saw. But just then, the sudden attack caught Alan and Sarah completely off guard. After barely escaping the infected, Alan decided to temporarily abandon the mission and resume in-depth research on the virus. Through their relentless efforts, they achieved another major breakthrough. They discovered the virus was man-made and contained a strange substance. However, they couldn't yet determine the purpose of this substance. Just then, the head of the facility, Hatake, returned, and Alan immediately stepped forward to confront him. Seeing that Alan had started to uncover the truth, Hatake continued lying, claiming that the substance could cure all incurable diseases. Yet he consistently refused to reveal its specific components. Unable to get satisfactory answers, Alan could only investigate alone in secret, trying to uncover what Hatake was hiding. Elsewhere, the assistant Daniel confessed to Hatake that he had eliminated Sergio. Hatake appeared deeply worried upon hearing this. Their conversation revealed Hatake feared this action might provoke even greater trouble. However, they didn't know that Sergio wasn't truly dead. At that moment, he was at the home of Anana, the only law enforcement officer in the Arctic region. She had brought him there with the sole purpose of investigating everything happening in the lab. Anana led Sergio into a room wallpapered with photos of all the children who had gone missing over the past 20 years. Her investigation revealed all these children were connected to the base, making her desperate to uncover its secrets. Naturally, Sergio remained tight-lipped, constantly looking for a chance to escape. That afternoon, Sergio finally found his opportunity to flee. But just as he was about to escape, he accidentally witnessed Anana meeting privately with Daniel. This set off alarm bells for Sergio. As the conversation unfolded, Sergio learned the man before him wasn't the real Daniel, but Anana's brother, Tulok. It turned out Anana had two younger brothers. One was kidnapped as a child, and she had spent years searching for him. Sergio vaguely guessed that Anana's missing brother was Daniel. Meanwhile, after in-depth research, Alan and Sarah discovered that ultra-low temperatures could destroy the virus. They immediately tested this method on Peter. The approach was effective, but the current temperature wasn't low enough. A stronger cold source was needed to completely eliminate the virus from Peter. Sarah suddenly recalled that a certain level of the lab had been used for cold precipitation experiments. Perhaps a solution could be found there. So Alan sought out Dr. Adrian and, with his help, obtained a stronger cold flame. In subsequent tests, Peter's condition indeed improved. However, they were unaware that Hatake and Daniel had been outside, monitoring their progress. Hatake seemed unsurprised by their discovery. After observing briefly, he left the base with Daniel to dispose of Sergio's body. But when they reached the snowfield, Sergio's body had vanished. Just then, several helicopters suddenly descended on the base. Seeing the markings on the aircraft, Hatake's expression instantly darkened. He recognized them as the helicopter fleet of the corporation's top executives. Meanwhile, Julia finally regained consciousness. Her eyes had inexplicably turned an eerie white, and her infection was completely cured. Back with Hatake, a team of heavily armed soldiers swiftly disembarked from the helicopters. Leading them was the corporation head Constance. She informed Hatake and the others that she was there to oversee their drug development. Results were required within 2 days. To this end, Constance even promised Alan could make any request. Alan stated he wanted them to bring Julia back safely, and Constance agreed without hesitation. She then spoke privately with Hatake. It turned out the corporation had funded this base not only to develop a cure for all terminal illnesses, but also to create the diseases themselves. That way, they could profit on both ends and skyrocket the company's value. However, Hatake had only invented the virus so far. Constance's patience was exhausted. She demanded the antidote be developed immediately, or everyone in the base would perish with Hatake. Naturally, Alan knew nothing of this, but sensing Constance was hiding something, he made preparations. He decided to hide the antidote once developed, keeping it as a backup. Additionally, Alan requested to accompany Constance's troops to the second level to find his ex-wife. Meanwhile, Sergio, who had been taken away, arrived at the base entrance with Anana. Daniel was visibly shocked to see Sergio alive. Nevertheless, he opened the base door. Anana, seeing her brother, rushed to embrace him. She then took out a photo of herself with Tulok, leaving Daniel completely stunned. He couldn't process the truth and instead ordered his men to restrain Sergio while he took Anana aside for questioning. He led her to a room. Seeing the childhood photos and Anana's genuine emotion, Daniel began to understand. Perhaps Hatake, who had raised him, was actually responsible for separating him from his family. Meanwhile, fully recovered, Julia was convinced her blood could be the key to defeating the virus. She decided to risk returning to the upper levels. En route, she encountered a group of infected individuals. Strangely, upon seeing Julia's eyes, they panicked and fled. At that precise moment, the missing Hatake found Julia again. Having heard Constance plan to search for Julia, he decided to move her first. Upon learning Julia's infection was cured and her eyes had changed, Hatake became visibly emotional, tears welling up. After some persuasion, he successfully convinced Julia to leave with him. To conceal Julia's eyes, Hatake deliberately covered them with a cloth. Meanwhile, Constance's fully armed team headed for the second level. A swarm of infected individuals suddenly appeared. Their combat strength was abnormally fierce. Even the armed soldiers were overwhelmed. Constance decided to abandon the search for Julia, quickly retreating upstairs with her remaining forces. Julia was now taken back to Hatake's lab, where she encountered Daniel and Anana. Daniel, hostile, ordered Julia taken away. Hatake was powerless to stop it. He could only secretly slip Julia a pair of contact lenses. Brought back to the lab, Julia soon met Alan, who had returned from the second level. They embraced tearfully, overcome with emotion. Julia quickly told her ex-husband Alan about her recovery. She believed her blood could be used to develop the antidote, but Alan considered it too risky. As he contemplated safer methods, an alarm suddenly blared. Infected individuals from the second level had infiltrated their floor via ventilation ducts and attacked the supply depot. Strangely, this attack was different. It was clearly organized and premeditated. Upon learning this news, Constance reacted with complete calm, even allowing the situation to develop and spread unchecked. Meanwhile, Alan found the restrained Hatake. He demanded to know if Hatake had done something to Julia on the second level, as he was the only one who had contact with her during that time. Alan strongly suspected Hatake had already developed the antidote. But Hatake told Alan Julia had overcome the infection herself. He then claimed Julia was now in grave danger, likely targeted by the corporation for capture and lifelong imprisonment for research. Alan immediately rushed back to Julia upon hearing this, only to find she had already been captured and imprisoned by Constance. They declared that Julia had become a vital asset for the corporation, and through her, they would research a cure for the virus. Julia naturally wouldn't just wait for doom. She noticed the ventilation duct in the room and planned to escape through it. But the duct was now crawling with infected individuals, and she soon encountered two. Strangely, they did not attack her. However, Julia's crisis wasn't over. Guards discovered her escape attempt and quickly reported it to Constance. She immediately ordered a manhunt. By this time, Julia had crawled above Alan's lab and contacted him and Sarah via intercom. Alan instructed Julia to rescue Hatake and help him regain control of the base. But when Julia freed Hatake, he suddenly attacked, sedating her into unconsciousness. When she awoke, she found herself holding half a photo of herself as a child. To Julia's shock, Hatake was standing beside her. Meanwhile, Alan cleverly deceived the guards, claiming they had successfully developed the antidote to lure Constance and her men into the lab. However, what they had actually made was a chemical bomb. Amid the chaos, Alan and Sarah swiftly escaped, hiding in another lab. Surprisingly, Constance survived the explosion, suffering only minor injuries. Furious at Alan's actions, she took his brother Peter hostage, threatening Alan to show himself immediately. At that moment, Sarah discovered a sonic weapon capable of temporarily incapacitating targets. Alan pretended to comply, slowly walking towards Constance. Just as she was off guard, Sarah secretly activated the sonic weapon, instantly disabling two guards. Then, the lab mysteriously lost power, and Hatake suddenly appeared. Amidst the confusion, they successfully rescued Peter. Hatake planned to lead everyone to another floor, but before that, he needed to return to the lab to retrieve Julia. Returning to the lab, however, they found Julia missing again. It turned out Julia had been recaptured by Constance's men after waking. Left with no choice, the group split up. Alan went to rescue Julia, while Hatake was responsible for eliminating Constance. Unexpectedly, Julia was right beside Constance and was about to be taken onto a helicopter, which would separate her from Alan forever. Fortunately, Hatake arrived just in time. To everyone's shock, Hatake was incredibly powerful. He took down Constance and her guards with his bare hands and successfully rescued Julia. He then preserved Constance's head in a container, just like Dr. Havitz. With that, control of the facility returned to Hatake. However, most people in the base were now under the control of the infected. They needed to eliminate this threat urgently. They used Sarah as bait to capture the infected individuals, but after great effort, they caught only one. For some reason, the infected from the second level had vanished without a trace. Soon after, Alan discovered the infected had gone underground through a tunnel. It seemed to lead to an area beyond the 20+ levels of labs. Hatake informed them that besides sub-level 24, there was a mysterious level 25 deep underground. That was the lab's virus vault, storing the original virus samples. Then, through surveillance footage, they watched in horror as the infected on level 25 were acting in an organized manner. Positioned centrally as their leader was Alan's brother Peter, with the infected bowing in submission to him. Clearly, the situation was now completely out of control. In addition, they had killed Constance, and within at most 2 days the company would notice the anomaly and send in troops to suppress them. To prevent the virus samples from falling into corporate hands, they had to destroy them before then. Alan proposed splitting into 2 teams. He and Julia would go to level 25 to destroy the virus. Hatake and Sarah, on the other hand, shut down the facility's temperature control system to freeze the entire base. Soon after, the base temperature began to plummet. Alan and Julia quickly reached level 25. The level was densely packed with infected individuals. Fortunately, the cold temporarily immobilized them. They carefully moved through the zombie crowd and successfully reached the virus vault. This vault held viruses from around the world. A leak would have unimaginable consequences. Just as they prepared to destroy the viruses, Sarah's tumor flared up. With no choice, Hatake had to urgently restart the temperature control system. As the temperature rose, the infected began to stir. Alan and Julia had to seize the moment before the infected fully awoke and leave the virus vault. Julia then discovered a passage leading deeper underground. Following the passage, they arrived at a cozy apartment. The sight stunned Julia, because it was identical to her childhood home. Connecting this with the half photo, Julia seemed to understand something, but there was no time for deeper inquiry. They had to return to the lab first. Unexpectedly, upon entering the lab, they encountered Peter and a large group of infected he led. At this critical moment, Julia revealed her white pupils. Seeing this, the infected panicked and fled, allowing them to escape harm. Later, they found Hatake and wanted to ask about the underground apartment, but upon learning that Sarah was in critical condition, they rushed to treat her first. During this time, Julia seized a moment alone with Hatake to ask about the apartment. This revealed an astonishing truth. She was actually Hatake's biological daughter. The identical white pupils were the ultimate proof of their blood relation. Years ago, his wife discovered he was kidnapping Inuit children. Enraged, she left with their daughter, causing their long separation. Julia immediately pressed him about why her eyes were different. She had noticed multiple times that infected individuals fled in panic upon seeing her eyes. Yet Hatake remained silent on the matter. This silence prevented Julia from fully trusting Hatake. Meanwhile, Alan discovered that the tumor inside Sarah had begun to spread, and it invading her brain was only a matter of time. He felt powerless to stop it. Just then, Hatake, monitoring the cameras, saw that the pathogen had been stolen by a researcher named Adrian, and he had already fled the base. Hatake immediately realized the danger. If the virus spread, the entire world could face destruction. They used satellite tracking to locate Adrian, finding an abandoned satellite station nearby, an ideal temporary hiding spot. So Alan and Julia braved the blizzard to go there, and sure enough, they found Adrian at the station. It turned out Adrian was actually a spy for another corporation. He intended to sell the virus to them in exchange for a huge reward. Fortunately, Alan and Julia arrived in time to subdue Adrian, preventing the tragedy. They then divided tasks, trying to contact the base. Alan found a backup generator and successfully activated the lighting system, but Julia was unable to repair the radio equipment and couldn't establish contact with the base. Just then, another unexpected event occurred. Luckily, Alan reacted swiftly, pulling Julia into an underground passage he had discovered earlier, temporarily escaping danger. This led them to uncover an even more astonishing revelation. In this dim underground space, they encountered a man with pale skin and pupils identical to Julia's. He seemed incoherent, claiming he had been imprisoned there for 30 years. But that seemed impossible, as the place had been abandoned for years with no food supply. No normal human could survive. However, what the man said was entirely true. From his fragmented words, they learned that people like him and Julia were called Immortals. They could survive for 40 days without food and immediately resurrected after death. After undergoing 10,000 deaths, they would achieve true immortality. This was how the man had survived over 30 years in the abandoned satellite station, but the endless cycle felt like eternal torment to him. He wished to complete the 10,000 deaths faster and begged them to end his life. As Alan and Julia hesitated, the killer tracked them down again, instantly overpowering them both. Fortunately, Daniel arrived just in time and successfully rescued them. They decided to set the satellite station ablaze, ending the man's suffering. Meanwhile, under Hatake's guidance, Sarah conducted in-depth research on Julia's genes. She discovered that Julia's DNA could enhance the immune system and directly attack tumors. Sarah was utterly shocked, fully aware of the implications. Hatake then injected Julia's cerebrospinal fluid into Sarah to help destroy her tumor. Just then, Alan and Julia returned to the base. Seeing Sarah unconscious, they told Hatake everything about their underground encounter. Hatake fell silent upon hearing it. After a long hesitation, Hatake revealed some truths. He had known about the man all along. In fact, it was Hatake who had locked him up and tortured him in that place. Years ago, That man had betrayed Julia's mother and joined the sinister corporation. To punish his betrayal, Hatake trapped him in that place. He then disclosed that the corporation's top executives were all immortals, numbering 500. This staggering revelation left Julia and Alan speechless with shock. While they talked, Sarah's condition suddenly deteriorated, leaving her with only hours to live. In this critical moment, Julia resolutely injected her own blood into Sarah. Under the influence of the powerful genes, Sarah quickly stabilized, and even the tumors inside her were completely eradicated. However, the crisis was far from over. Hatake received a message from the corporation. At least 100 armed soldiers were approaching the base. To counter the threat, Hatake placed explosives throughout the base's sectors. He then prepared to lead everyone into the underground bunker he had built earlier. It was the same underground apartment Julia and Alan had found, featuring a secret passage leading directly to the surface. Hatake planned to detonate the explosives when the corporation forces arrived, taking them all down together. But worse events unfolded one after another. Personnel in the base began mysteriously disappearing. Later investigation revealed Peter was leading his infected minions to capture them for experimentation. After collecting large amounts of infected blood, Peter and his group injected it into the reservoir. Alan had previously housed everyone in the same room for safety, which inadvertently gave Peter the opportunity. They sprayed the blood throughout the room via the pipes. By the time Alan returned, everyone was infected. The entire base fell, leaving only Alan and a few others as survivors. In desperation, Alan suddenly recalled yesterday's experiment. They had mixed the prototype antidote with coolant for a mouse test, and surprisingly found the virus was eliminated. So, Hatake and Julia, wearing protective suits, carried the antidote to the second level. They used coolant to immobilize the infected, then immediately injected them with the antidote. Before long, everyone, including Peter, returned to normal. Just as they managed the infected situation, the base alarm blared. The corporation's forces had arrived. Alan and the others armed themselves, ready to fight, but found that the snowmobiles were empty. They sensed danger. The corporation's special forces seized the chance to forcibly repel into the base. Hatake knew the newcomers were hostile. Their leader, known as Scythe, was the corporation's most feared assassin. Seeing the danger, Daniel immediately pressed the bomb detonator, but the expected explosion never came. It turned out Scythe had anticipated this and brought a device to block the bomb signals. Had his mission not required capturing Hatake alive and retrieving the virus and cure, he would have wiped everyone out. Inside the bunker, the group nervously planned their next move. Daniel went up to check the situation but found no trace of Scythe's team. Alan guessed they might be lurking in the shadows, closely monitoring their movements. He decided to take Hatake back upstairs, deliberately exposing their location to draw attention. Julia and the others stayed behind in the bunker. Things unfolded exactly as Alan predicted. Scythe was indeed watching everything closely via surveillance screens. Then, his eyes suddenly locked onto Hatake, and a surge of fury ignited within him. Because Constance was his mother, to avenge her, Scythe launched his revenge without hesitation. He saw Hatake and Alan organizing an evacuation, and silently followed them, unaware it was a trap. Hatake knew he was no match, so he merely acted as bait to draw attention. He threw the antidote onto the snowy ground nearby. Scythe's subordinate rushed to retrieve it, only for the ground to suddenly collapse, plunging her into an abyss. However, they realized Scythe himself had vanished. Clearly, the ambush had failed. The base situation grew increasingly critical, forcing everyone back to the bunker to discuss their next strategy. Meanwhile, Scythe learned Hatake had a daughter in the base. He decided to exploit this, making Hatake feel the pain of losing a loved one. Soon after, as Alan's group prepared to go to the lab for the antidote, the elevator suffered a power failure. Though the emergency power kicked in, Julia mysteriously vanished. They rushed back to the bunker to search, only finding a container on the ground holding a severed finger and a threatening note. The finger unmistakably belonged to Julia. Faced with this brutal reality, they were momentarily at a loss. At this critical moment, Daniel acted recklessly, leading to his own capture by Scythe. When Hatake faced Scythe, Scythe forced him to choose: save his biological daughter or his adopted son Daniel. Hatake was plunged into deep turmoil. Just then, Daniel resolutely chose to sacrifice himself. The sudden turn of events stunned even Scythe. Hatake seized the opportunity and finally subdued Scythe, but the danger wasn't over. Through interrogation, Julia and the others learned Scythe had brought Julia's mother to the base. To find out her mother's exact location, Julia subjected Scythe to brutal interrogation, but he remained silent. After an unknown length of time, Scythe mockingly told them to watch the news. They then discovered the base's virus had already spread. Plagues were erupting in many regions, countless infected, untold numbers dead. They urgently found Hatake. Hatake was equally shocked. He had no idea how the virus had spread. The immediate priority was finding Hatake's wife, Jane. Based on the base layout, they believed the security room on the lower level was likely the enemy's operations center. The group decided Peter would stay behind to monitor the situation, while the others rushed to the operations center to rescue the trapped Jane. Upon arrival, they were shocked to find Sergio also there. Fortunately, Sergio seized a chance to knock out the guard, escaping captivity. He had come to save the kidnapped children. After successfully rescuing Jane, Sergio quickly wrote down the list of children and handed it to Hatake. Hatake then entrusted the antidote and virus samples to Alan. Meanwhile, Peter secretly infiltrated the isolation chamber holding Scythe. It turned out he had secretly colluded with the corporation, hoping to become one of the Immortals to satisfy his desire for eternal life and be with Julia forever. So Peter deliberately freed Scythe. Back to Julia's side. Since her mother's rescue, she focused fully on helping her regain consciousness. Imprisoned too long, Jane's memory had regressed, seemingly stuck in Julia's childhood. She couldn't recognize anyone around her. Just then, the base alarm suddenly sounded. Hatake and Alan armed themselves and went to check the entrance, only to find it was Anana and her brother coming to their aid. They somberly informed them of Daniel's sacrifice, causing Anana to nearly break down instantly. At that moment, a battered Peter appeared, reporting Scythe's escape to Alan. Not daring to delay, everyone prepared to evacuate. But just then, a researcher found Sarah. During her recent blood test, he discovered she was pregnant. Sarah was at a loss with this sudden news. As Alan was the only one she'd been close to recently, she didn't know how to tell him. On the other side, just as Alan was about to leave, he suddenly saw Scythe appear in front of him holding a bomb detonator. Before Alan could react, Scythe pressed the button. Many researchers died in the flames. Scythe then seized Julia. As Alan watched his love being taken, he jumped onto the helicopter without hesitation. Julia was deeply moved by Alan's action, but concerned for his safety, she decided to push him away. Allowing herself to be taken by Scythe, time passed in a flash. Over 200 days vanished. Alan now searched everywhere for clues about Julia, but he never expected Julia wasn't in danger. Instead, she appeared radiant, seemingly the leader of the corporation's 500 Immortals. The film ends here. Helix Season 1 premiered in January 2014. The show's premise isn't novel, falling into the common infected zombie genre. The middle plot leaves much to be desired, with slow-paced storytelling, while the biggest highlight is arguably the cliffhanger ending. Beyond this, feel free to share your views in the comments section below. Alright, that's all for today's video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.